Hey, my name is John, and I'm the campus pastor here at the Center Church. Before we jump into the sermon, I want to remind you that our vision is for every person to be plugged into a community of faith that preaches the Word of God. Our goal is not that this would be a replacement for a community, but rather a supplement to your faith walk. We strongly encourage everyone to enter a physical community where they can be known, use their talents, and work with others to proclaim the gospel. And our goal is that this would give you the opportunity to add to your faith walk. If you'd like more info on where and when we meet, you can find that at centergr.com. Again, thanks for listening, and we hope God speaks powerfully to you in this message.
And we're going to be in Nehemiah 13. And before we jump into Nehemiah 13, you need to know that we're in a series right now called Wars and Walls. This is week 6 of this Wars and Walls series. And we're wrapping it up today. So we're almost done. Last week, we talked about kind of this crazy interaction that the people of Israel had and with each other, but more importantly, in their relationship with God. How they got right with him. They came together and they did this thing called repentance and confession. They all came together and they publicly confessed their sin, publicly confessed their wrong, publicly said, we were wrong, we didn't honor God, we didn't follow him, we didn't do what he said, and so here's where they were, and they confessed that and they said, we're going to change for good, and we're done. And so it was this crazy, awesome, worshipful, repentant moment, but then something happened. So before we jump into that, I want to share with you my favorite Disney character, or one of my favorite Disney characters, and I want to tell you why they're my favorite. So how many of you know who this is? Anybody? I'm going to tell you why Dory is my favorite Disney character. She introduced or brought to light an epidemic that is very part of my experience in life, and it is called, anybody? Any guesses? Short-term memory loss, okay? Anybody else, you walk into a Meijer and you get in and you walk in and you walk to the grocery aisle and you go, I have no idea why I walked in here. This is the most frustrating thing. I've known all week that I had to be here for one specific thing, and so I just start walking around, and I just do this. Maybe some of you guys, especially, you do this. You just walk until you see something that refreshes your memory, right? So I just walk down aisle after aisle after aisle. I get a whole shopping cart full of stuff. I take it out. I load it up. I'm driving home. I'm 2 minutes before I get home, and I remember the one thing that I did not get that I went there in the first place. Anybody else have this experience? This is why I love Dory, okay? Because Dory, she starts talking, she starts interacting, she's moving a little bit, and then she turns around and she says, why are you following me? And it happens over and over and over and over and over again. So that's why I love Dory. And it's funny, right? Short-term memory loss. Here's a question, though. Do you ever go to your boss and say, like, you have 2 quick questions and then forget the second one? You ever do that? Or do you ever talk to your spouse and say, hey, I have something really important that I want to talk to you about, this and one other thing, and so you talk about the first thing and then you can't remember the second thing? This is my life, and it's super entertaining unless you're married to me, right? So if you talk to my wife, or if I brought my wife up here and she started sharing, she would say, this is a source of frustration in our marriage. So I just wrote this down. It can be extremely entertaining unless you're married to that person, you're parenting that person, you're best friends with that person, or probably most importantly, you work for that person. Can I get an amen this morning? Amen. Okay, glad we're on the same page. So it makes sense that we would forget or could forget little things in life, but isn't it true that sometimes we forget big, extraordinary, life-changing things as well? So that's why we started off talking about Israel and where Israel was. So I want to just catch you up just so that you understand the context and where we're at today. Nehemiah 13. Nehemiah is this guy who works for the king, and he goes to Jerusalem and he sees Jerusalem and the walls that are torn down and they're broken and they're vulnerable. And what Nehemiah didn't just see was broken walls. What he saw was broken hearts and a broken relationship with God that the wall represented. And so he led this group of Israelites. He said, we're going to rebuild the wall. We're going to do it. We're going to do it quick. And so in 52 days, he rebuilt this wall. And for a lot of us, you go, okay, that's great. You know, it's probably, like a white picket fence and you just go all the way around. I want to show you the magnitude of this wall that he built. So here's a couple pictures. If we start and zoom out, you can kind of see there's like this road that travels on the bottom third of your screen. This is modern day Jerusalem, and the wall is still there. You can still go see the wall. So if we zoom in a little bit, you see the shadow more, right? Just defining the sun, where the sun's at. You can see the outline of the wall. But to get close enough that I want you to grasp how big this is, check this out. Those are people underneath, and this is the wall that they rebuilt and reconstructed finally, let's get really close up. This is how big that wall was. So do you understand how this wasn't just some white picket fence in a nice little neighborhood that they put around their city, and it basically had a little sign that said, "Big dog, keep out," right? This was a big wall that was used in military and used to protect them and used for fighting and etc. This was a very big, important wall that needed to be rebuilt, not just because of their relationship with God, but also because of their relationships with the people around them and the vulnerability that came with a wall that was broken and decrepit. And so Nehemiah said, we're going to rebuild this thing, and we're going to do it. We're going to do it now. And so they did this. They rebuilt the whole wall around Jerusalem in 52 days. Mind you, no bulldozers, no dump trucks, no cranes. This is just manual labor. And they just worked and they accomplished it and they got it done, and they had this crazy awesome moment, which we talked about last week, in which all of them gathered together. Here they are, thousands and thousands and thousands of men and women and children, and they celebrate the wall, right? I mean, can you imagine just looking at it? You just see it in the background. This huge wall, and they celebrate it, but they do that by taking this. A quarter of the day was devoted to worship. Just what we just did. And then another quarter of the day was devoted to just reading God's word, opening up, picking it up and just saying, okay, what does God want to say to us? What does he want to say? What does he want to teach us? What does he want us to do? And as they would read, they would find something and they would go, okay, we need to do this right now. And then they would go do it. And then the next day they came back and they would do it again. They did this for 23 days straight. They read, they worshiped, and then they went back and changed. They read, they worshiped, then they went back and changed over and over. Can you imagine how much this would have changed, not just a city, but marriages and families, and ultimately a relationship with God with such devotion and regular attention? This changed the trajectory of the Israelites forever. But something happened that adjusted or altered that trajectory that we still talk about and still read about today. So that's what we're going to read today. So Nehemiah 13, if you have Nehemiah 13, pull that out. And Nehemiah 13, starting in verse 1, it says this: On that day, the book of Moses was read aloud in the hearing of the people. And there it was found written that no Ammonite or Moabite should ever be admitted into the assembly of God. So this is important because the Ammonites and the Moabites had a history with Israel, and the Ammonites and the Moabites were not good to Israel. So God made a rule, and he said, hey, you are not to let them in my temple, right? They violated this relationship in the past. Don't do it again. So, and it says this, verse 2, because they had not met the Israelites with food and water, but had hired Balaam to call a curse down on them. Our God, however, turned the curse into a blessing. When the people heard this law, they excluded from Israel all who were of foreign descent. Before this, Eliashib, the priest, had been put in charge of the storerooms of the house of our God. He was closely associated with Tobiah. So that one line is really, really important because Tobiah was an Ammonite. Okay? Are you tracking with me so far? God said keep out the Ammonites and the Moabites. Keep them out. But now the priest in charge of maintaining the temple was best buds with Toby. Okay? Guy named Tobiah. We're going to call him Toby because that's way easier for me to remember. So let's keep reading. Here's what happened. And he had provided him with a large room formerly used to store the grain offerings and incense and temple articles, and also the tithes of grain, new wine, and olive oil, prescribed for the Levites, musicians, and gatekeepers, as well as the contributions for the priests. Uh-oh. Did you notice? The rule was no Ammonites or Moabites. And now Eliashib, the priest, the one who's in charge of maintaining and enforcing that rule, is best friends with Toby, who's an Ammonite, who basically, Toby comes over and goes, hey, I really need a room. I need some space. I got a lot of stuff. You got a lot of room. Could we make that happen? And what does Eliashib do? Come on in. Come on in. Set up shop. So you just ask, why? Why is this happening? Well, all of this was going on. Nehemiah is writing this. I was not in Jerusalem. For in the 32nd year of Artaxerxes, king of Babylon, I had returned to the king. Right? Every parent that's watching this saw this coming. Agree or disagree? How many of you have had the conversation with your kids before you leave? Or for those of you that were the kids at one point, aka all of you, who had the chat with mom and dad before mom and dad were going to leave for an extended period of time, and they said, okay, you know the rules. This is how it's going to work. Stay out of the refrigerator, do your homework, turn the TV off, and by the way, Toby cannot come over, okay? We clear on that? Everybody clear? Everybody good? Good. Bye. What happens 30 seconds after parents leave? Toby, hey, come on over, wide open, and let's turn on the TV, and the fridge is wide open, and we can do whatever we want because mom and dad aren't coming back all night. Perfect, right? So you saw this coming. This is what happened. Nehemiah's dad, Nehemiah leaves, and he says, this is the way that it should be. And as soon as he leaves, Eliashib, Toby, come on over. Check this out. I got the whole room. I got the whole place to myself. We can do whatever we want. And so what happens is decision after decision after decision after decision keeps being made in which God had said earlier, here are the rules. Here are the things I want you to do. Here are the ways that you ought to live. Get this. Make this clear. The rules that God had put in place that the people read and internalized and changed to obey one by one for these 10 or 12 years that Nehemiah was gone, they went, we can give a little bit on that one. We can sacrifice on this one. This one's not as big of a deal as some of the other ones. As long as we don't give in this one, we're okay. And so over 10 or 12 years, they continued to cave and continued to change. And this big, important moment that we just read about last week, in which the whole country of Israel redirected and turned the steering wheel and started driving towards their relationship with God, what happened is they got off course again. So let's keep reading. Nehemiah 13, starting in the second part of verse 6, says, sometime later I asked his permission and came back to Jerusalem. So this is Nehemiah asking King Artaxerxes for permission to go back. Here I learned about the evil thing Eliashib had done in providing Tobiah a room in the courts of the house of God. I was greatly displeased and threw all of Tobiah's household goods out of the room. I gave orders to purify the rooms, and then I put back into them the equipment of the house of God with the grain offerings and the incense. I also learned that the portions assigned to the Levites had not been given to them, and that all the Levites and musicians responsible for the service had gone back into their own fields. So I rebuked the officials and asked them, why is the house of God neglected? This is a big one, guys. Why are you neglecting the house of God? Don't you remember? Don't you remember what we just did? Why are you neglecting the house of God? Then I called them together and stationed them at their posts. Let's keep reading. Nehemiah 13, verse 15. In those days, I saw people in Judah treading wine presses on the Sabbath. So they're working on the day that God set aside as holy and said, don't work. Here's another one. And bringing in grain and loading it on donkeys together with wine, grapes, figs, and all other kinds of loads. And they were bringing all this into Jerusalem on the Sabbath. Therefore, I warned them against selling food on that day. People from Tyre who lived in Jerusalem were bringing in fish and all kinds of merchandise and selling them in Jerusalem on the Sabbath to the people of Judah. Another one. I rebuked the nobles of Judah and said to them, listen to this, what is this wicked thing you are doing? Desecrating the Sabbath day. Catch this. Didn't your ancestors do the same things so that our God brought all this calamity on us and on this city? Now you are stirring up more wrath against Israel by desecrating the Sabbath. You want to know the worst part about the book of Nehemiah? That's where our story ends. So they started in that situation. They started broken and messed up and apart from God. And then Nehemiah comes and has a burden and a weight and says, you guys, we got to move into it. We blew it. We've wronged it. Let's just move in and make our relationship with God right again. And so they follow and they spend 52 days doing that. And then they spend 24 days rebuilding their relationship with God, reading this book and then changing their lives, reading this book, changing their lives, reading this book, changing their lives over and over and over to get till they get to the point where everybody acknowledges we've been so far off, now we're back on together, and then in a short amount of time, just a mere 10 years or 12 years later, they forget all of it, and they end up right back where they started. What can we pull from a text like that for a sermon today? In which you look and you go, I wish it would have ended like 3 chapters earlier. Right? Why not just end the book when they were at the mountaintop and they were at the peak and they had done everything right and they made right with God? And of course they had some rocky parts along the way, but why would you end on a note like this? And here's what I think. I think the people of Israel had a great leader in Nehemiah. I think we as people need a leader that can lead us back to the throne room of God and say, this is what God teaches, this is what he instructs, this is what he says, and this is how we need to change and adhere and learn and understand and then ultimately submit to it. We need Nehemiahs in our life. And so they had a great leader in Nehemiah who stood up to their enemies, who exhibited great faith, who called them to resolve and called the Israelites to something greater, something better than what they were experiencing. They needed Nehemiah for this course correction, like Blake talked about last week, to get back and restore the relationship with God. The people loved him, they were inspired by him, they learned from him, and they grew exponentially under his leadership. But when he was no longer with them, they forgot about the one that he led them to, and the one who showed them mercy, and about the one that forgave them, and about the one who called them to something greater from the start. You guys, this is our story. That all of us could sit where we're at right now and look back on life. And I bet you many of us, if you're a Christian or if you're a follower of Jesus, could look back on a time that you said, I remember the day that Jesus broke into my life and got a grip of my heart and just radically changed me from the inside out. And I remember every time I read this book, it just came to life and the words jumped off the page and it spoke to different parts of my heart and different relationships and different aspects of my life and different things that I hadn't yet submitted. I remember when I read it and when I understood for the first time. I've shared this story with you before. A story in Luke 7 about a funeral for a young boy. And the pastor said, here's the thing, this young boy died and was in the middle of his own funeral, and Jesus came and interrupted the funeral and brought him back to life and turned it on all of us and said, how many of you are in the middle of your own funeral right now? And I remember that was the day that I stood up and I said, yeah, everything's dead in my life. Relationships are killing me. Sin is killing me. Doubt is killing me. Purpose is killing. I just feel like I'm in the middle of my own funeral and I want Jesus. And that's what this pastor spoke to. But that's what Nehemiah spoke to for the sake of his people. And so many of us, as we look back on our lives, we can say, I remember that moment, or I had that moment, or maybe I'm praying for that moment that I could understand it for the first time, that I could see God for who he is. I want that. But here's what happens over time. Sometimes we just forget. Right? Like walking into Meijer and going, I have no idea why I'm here. But I knew I was supposed to go to Meijer for something, so I'm going to walk around until I figure it out. I'm going to text my wife, even though I don't get cell service in Meijer, and say, why am I here? Some of us, maybe we get to this point in life and we go, why am I here in life right now? I don't know how I got here. I don't know where I'm going. I don't know what I came here for. I remember what it was like years and years ago when Jesus broke in, but for some reason it's not translating right now. What happened? What's going on? What am I missing? Oftentimes it's just the moment or the experience tends to wear off or die down and we forget. For many of us, that is our story. So here's what's crazy, though, is that there's a difference between never forgetting and remembering. And this is just where I want to spend a little bit of time today as we talk. I just need to read this because we need to get details right. Never forgetting speaks to knowledge. So to say I'll never forget something means I'll never forget the information that happened around a certain event. I'll tell you, I'll never forget my wedding day. It was awesome. It was great. Watched my wife come down. People that were there, most important people in the world, were all there, and they were all present. And I remember the day. I remember the celebration. Or I remember the day that I gave my life to the Lord. I remember it was just an exciting day, and it was important, and it was impactful, and it made the difference to me. But I remember information about it. But so to never forget something is to remember information, but to remember something is to relive or re-experience that day or that moment. And so I'll ask you this question. How many of you remember right where you were at on September 11, 2001 in the morning? You probably remember right where you were at and right what you were doing, and you remember right when you got the news that at 8:46 a.m. American Airlines Flight 11 crashed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center. We'll never forget that day. At 9:03 a.m., United Flight 175 crashed into the South Tower of the World Trade Center. When we see images like this, it takes us back to the moment. We remember the information, we remember where we were at, we remember what happened, we remember how it happened, we remember the confusion, we remember names of those involved, we remember what it did to our country, we remember the news that exploded. We'll never forget. How many of you saw this picture floating around, or pictures like it, that said the words, "We will never forget. We will never forget, never forget, never forget." This was one of the most defining moments in our country, in its history. And it was a blow to us as a country. Almost 18 years later, we are all still remembering, but to some, the memory changed. We remember the information, remember what happened, remember where we were, we remember how it kind of unfolded and the details that came out, but it's a different thing to say, I want to remember the experience in a way that leads to transformation and growth and life change. There's a story I stumbled upon on Facebook just this week, actually, and it gripped me in a way that I just wanted to share it with you. But it looks like this. We're going to play the video behind. It's two firefighters that suit up. They put on all their gear. One of them has the tank on, put the hat on, and they go to their local gym, which is Planet Fitness, and they get on the stair stepper, and they walk 110 flights of stairs up and 110 flights of stairs down every September 11th, every single year, year after year after year after year after year. You see the difference between never forgetting and always remembering? Never forgetting is, I'll never forget that day and what it was like and how it felt. But to remember that day, like these firefighters do, who say, I never want to forget the people's names of those that I love that I lost. I never want to forget the weight of my gear going 110 stories up into the towers. I never want to forget the fear that I felt walking in. I never want to forget the people that I was going for to rescue. I never ever want to forget, but I want to remember them. You see the difference? The Israelites needed to remember the pain of a broken relationship with God. The Israelites needed to remember what the vulnerability of a broken wall felt like. The Israelites needed to remember the chaos that idolatry and sin allowed to run and ruin their lives. The Israelites needed to remember the pain and the brokenness and the burden and the weight of a relationship apart from God, so that they could appreciate and know and understand, and most importantly, remember the goodness of God, the faithfulness of God, which is what we just sang about this morning, and the abundant love and mercy that He showed them. Like the Israelites, many of us today need to remember who Jesus is and what He did for us up there on the cross. that's where we're going to close today. That I want to just lead us to a point where we could just spend a little time, just us one-on-one with God, and remember who Jesus is and what he did for us on our behalf. It says in 1 Corinthians 11, verse 23, it says, the night that Jesus was betrayed, he took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it, and he said to his disciples, this is my body, which is broken for you. Do this in, say it with me, remembrance of me. You catch the significance? Then he takes the wine. He took the cup after supper, saying, this cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this as often as you drink it in, say it with me, remembrance of me. What God knows about the human heart is that we so easily forget things like transformation. Moments when God breaks in and says, I remember when you were broken and lost and scared and lonely. I remember when you were there, and that's when I moved in and I rescued you and I brought you back out. But if we don't relive that experience and we remember, if we forget what it was like before our relationship with Jesus, we can't truly appreciate, know, and understand who Jesus is on the other side. So I would just love to invite you to just close your eyes right now. And we're going to move into a time of communion together, and we're going to respond with worship. But I just want to challenge you to think back. For those of you that are followers of Jesus, that you say, Jesus, my life is his, I want you to think back, what was my life like before Jesus? Maybe it was full of fear, failure, unknown, brokenness, pain, doubt, uncertainty, purposeless. I want you to think back. For those of you that maybe aren't there yet, I just want you to think about where you're at in life right now. Are there things that are broken? Are there things that aren't going well? Or is there something that you just feel like you're missing in your heart? Is there something that you desire, something that you want more of? I just want you to think about just for a second and take time and just meditate on where are you at right now in regards or in relationship to your soul. We have the best story in the world. And the story is that Jesus came, the Son of God. He was born a man who lived a perfect and sinless life so that he could get up on a cross at the age of 33 and take on the sin and the burden of the world so that they might be made right with God. And Jesus said, I will take their sin, I will take their shame, I will take their brokenness, I will take their fear, I will take all of it so that they might experience life in a relationship with me and life abundantly. As you take some time just to spend time with the Lord, I just want you to reflect on who he is, on his goodness, on his faithfulness, on his love, on his mercy. And when you're ready, I want to invite you to come up, to grab the bread, to take a sip of the wine, and to remember the sacrifice that Jesus paid for all of us so we might spend eternity with him.